Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Pamela Thomas Memorial Lecture. My name's Ed Ludlow. I will be the technical host for this evening's lecture. It's a pleasure to see people here. Please be aware that I will be here throughout the whole thing, even if my camera's off, to field any technical queries. Hopefully none, but we're all learning about these events and we'll see how things pan out. If you have a question to submit to Professor Tomkins, please do that via the chat or the Q&A facility. We won't be unmuting people individually, but send your questions in and I'll ensure they get to Sir Bob one way or another. Finally, we just need to make you aware that we are recording tonight's lecture and it will be available on the Society's YouTube channel after the event. And now it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Lord Hunt to introduce the event formally.
Welcome, everyone. Speaking from the House of Lords, which probably explains the wallpaper behind me, which we all admire. But suffice it to say that when I joined the Society of Conservative Lawyers almost exactly 50 years ago, it was run by a formidable, amazing lady called Pamela Thomas. Pamela Thomas was the lifeblood, the inspiration of the Society, and she ran it for many years and involved members of the Cabinet, members of Parliament, and leading lawyers from all sides of the profession. And it is in her memory that we now hold an annual lecture, and this is the 4th annual lecture. And Pamela Thomas would be thrilled that Professor Adam Tomkins has agreed to come and give this lecture. Of course, I'll hand over to Bob Neill in just a moment, but I have to tell you that Adam is such a respected and leading authority on constitutional law, just the sort of person that Pamela Thomas would have been urging people to listen to. And it's in that context that I not only welcome you and welcome Adam, but hand over now to the chairman of the Executive Committee, Sir Bob Neill.
Well, thank you very much, David. Good to see you as always, and you will have gathered that we've moved down to the Commons end of the building now, and I'm in Portcullis House, rather more functional background, but great to see everybody, and I'm delighted to welcome everybody, as David has. This is a really important annual event for us, and it's a real pleasure to have Professor Adam Tomkins giving us this Pamela Thomas lecture. A little bit about Adam Tomkins, if I may. As David trailed, Adam's got a glittering academic and legal background, a remarkable authority in a raft of numbers, having started teaching at Oxford, King's in London, later then moving, of course, to the University of Glasgow. But in that time, fitting in 2 of the major books on British constitutional law, Public Law in 2003 and British Government and the Constitution in 2011, cited in cases in the House of Lords, expert evidence in a number of important cases, as well as giving evidence on the sovereignty of Parliament, which was extensively cited. I can find the references still in Hansard in the European Union Bill of 2010-2011, as well as an international lecturing reputation and an advisor to the Lords Select Committee on the Constitution in 2009. Having been Professor John Miller, the John Miller Professor of Public Law at the University of Glasgow, having joined that law school in 2003. He was lured into politics in 2016 as MSP for the Glasgow region, having had made something of a journey to join the Conservative Party and been very active in the campaign against Scottish separatism in 2014, which I know remains a great passion of Adam's. He is Shadow Minister, Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Communities, Social Security, Constitution and Equalities in the team at Holyrood. Sadly, he's leaving Holyrood at the next election, but I'm sure won't be lost either to the law or politics in other capacities. So, Adam, it's a real pleasure to have you with us, and we look forward very much to hearing what you've got to say.
Well, thank you very much, Sir Bob, and thank you, Lord Hunt, and thank you to everybody in the Society for inviting me to deliver this evening's lecture. It's a real honour to be here. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. The end of Henry IV Part 2 is well known for that extraordinarily poignant moment when Hal, newly crowned as King Henry V, banishes his great friend Sir John Falstaff. "I know thee not, old man." The new king instructs his court, "Presume not that I am the thing I was, for God doth know, so shall the world perceive that I have turned away my former self." Shakespeare adds to the dramatic intensity of the scene by placing it after and contrasting it with Hal's treatment of his father's Lord Chief Justice. We're told earlier in the play that the Lord Chief Justice had once had Hal arrested and detained for breach of his father's peace. Upon the demise of Henry IV, the Lord Chief fears that at least he will be removed from office, and perhaps that his head will be removed from his shoulders. His plea to the new king is that it was his father's law he was administering, and that he will be every bit as loyal, diligent, and faithful in executing Henry V's laws as he had been in following the commandments of Henry IV, even to the point of enforcing those laws against the heir to the crown himself. To which King Henry V responds as follows: "You are right, Justice, and you weigh this well. Therefore still bear the balance and the sword, and I do wish your honours may increase till you do live to see a son of mine offend you and obey you as I did. So shall I live to speak my father's words. Happy am I that I have a man so bold that dares do justice on my proper son, and not less happy having such a son that would deliver up his greatness so into the hands of justice. You did commit me, for which I do commit into your hand the unstained sword that you have used to bear, with this remembrance, that you use the same with the like bold, just, and impartial spirit as you have done against me. There is my hand. You shall be as a father to my youth. My voice shall sound as you do prompt mine ear, and I will stoop and humble my intents to your well-practiced, wise directions." Now, Shakespeare cannot possibly have known this, but all the major elements of modern constitutional law are contained within this rather magnificent speech: sovereignty, the rule of law, the separation of powers, and the independence of the judiciary. What Shakespeare surely did know is that the words he placed in the new king's mouth exude judgment. It is Henry's judgment that he has to dispense with Jack Falstaff. It is his judgment that he needs his principal legal counsellor to act at all times in that bold, just, and impartial spirit that is so essential. And it is his judgment that whatever his intentions as ruler, he will have to take heed of the well-practiced, wise directions that come from the great office-bearers of state. I share the view made by the great American literary critic Harold Bloom, amongst many others, that there is no character in all of Shakespeare more fun, more human, more alive than Sir John Falstaff. But my argument this evening is that in today's constitutional politics, we need rather less Falstaff and a good deal more of the sober, prudent realism of the young Henry V. Henry's speech to the Lord Chief Justice is just one of many speeches found in Shakespeare's history plays about the nature of rulership. Medieval kings were certainly powerful. They and everyone around them knew that they were sovereign in the fullest sense of that term. They knew that sovereignty was a gift, but also that it was a terrible burden, and they gave voice to the impossible weight it placed on their shoulders. Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown. The young King Henry V has been well and truly warned by his father that what awaits him is perilously difficult. So the new king is wise beyond his years, to insist that not only his Lord Chief Justice, but everyone in his court shares in his rule. He knows, sovereign though he may be, that he cannot rule alone. Now, the more I reflect on it, the more unhelpful I think the concept of sovereignty is. And I think it's unhelpful for two reasons. It does not reflect the realities of modern government, and it leads those who believe in it to make basic errors. Errors of precisely the sort that Shakespeare's Henry V sought to avoid when he decided to keep his father's Lord Chief Justice in office. And the whole scene, I should perhaps point out, is of Shakespeare's imagination. There is no historical evidence that Prince Harry was in fact arrested by his father's judges, and Henry IV's elderly Lord Chief Justice in fact retired when the old king died in 1413. Be that as it may, sovereignty does not reflect the realities of modern government because, in truth, power is not concentrated, it is shared. And those who fail to understand this risk acting in such a way that they will cause things which are precious, the Constitution, perhaps even the country itself, to fracture and shatter. Now, regrettably, these are not hypothetical risks. We are living with them here in the United Kingdom right now. I'm not the first to say it, but I wish Dicey had never used the phrase, the sovereignty of Parliament. Because when he used that phrase, he wasn't actually talking about Parliament, and he wasn't actually talking about sovereignty either. What he was talking about was legislation. In particular, he was talking about statutes, and he was talking about the relation in our law of statute to common law. What Dicey said about the sovereignty of Parliament is true. I just wish he didn't call it that. What he said, of course, was that as a matter of law, Parliament may make or unmake any law whatever, and that nobody has the right to override or set aside a provision of an Act of Parliament. These rules, he said, are the keystone of the Constitution, the central principle upon which all else depends. And it's worth pausing for a moment to consider how this came to be true. Like all successful constitutions, the British Constitution is based on a compromise in our case that reconciles in harmony the two claims to sovereignty that had competed to the point of destruction in the 17th century. Parliament on the one hand and the Crown on the other. In our most foundational constitutional documents, in the Bill of Rights and the Act of Settlement, the twin claims to sovereignty of the Commons and of the Crown are brought together, reconciled and balanced. Neither can rule without the other. The Crown and its ministers set policy, but its delivery depends on supply, which is in the hands of the Commons. The Crown may neither suspend nor dispense with the law, but at the same time, Parliament cannot make laws without the Crown's assent. The Crown may tax its subjects, but only with Parliament's consent. And the Crown may raise or keep a standing army even in times of peace, but again, only with Parliament's consent. In scrutinising these matters, whether they be of high policy, war and peace, or taxation, members of Parliament enjoy complete freedom, freedom from arrest and an absolute freedom of speech that cannot be impeached or questioned in any court. The 17th century was marked by conflict between Parliament and the Crown. An Act of Parliament, by contrast, is the legal instrument that marks the formal agreement of Parliament and the Crown. We all know that an Act requires the assent of the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the monarch. The resolution of the constitutional conflicts of the 17th century meant that neither the House of Commons nor the Crown, acting alone, could make or unmake any law whatever. But when they act together, their combined weight and authority cannot be overridden or set aside by any force of law. This does not make Parliament sovereign, but it does make statute, that is to say, it does make acts of the Crown in Parliament supreme over all other sources of law in the legal systems of the United Kingdom. And I wish Dicey had called it that, legislative supremacy over the common law rather than the sovereignty of Parliament. It is the sharing of legislative power between the Houses of Parliament and the Crown that makes statute supreme. The common law is made by only one source of authority, the courts. Statute, by contrast, is made by three, the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the Crown acting together. If sovereignty were understood as the sharing of power, rather than as its concentration in a single body or person, that would save us all a lot of trouble. I refer you back to Henry V. Shakespeare's king understood that his reign would be more likely to be happy and glorious if he exercised his sovereign power with and in the light of the well-practiced wise directions of his Lord Chief Justice. And this is my main theme this evening, that power, even so-called sovereign power, should be understood as being shared and not concentrated. And I've already mentioned both of the reasons why. First, because this is accurate as a reflection of how power actually is in modern Britain. And secondly, because to think otherwise leads us into error. Error, moreover, that could cost us things that we profess to hold dear. Modern constitutions have devised two doctrines that help us understand how power is shared. These doctrines have multiple names, but they are best known as the separation of powers and as federalism. And despite Dycean orthodoxy and our traditional focus on sovereignty, the modern United Kingdom constitution owes as much to these doctrines as does any other European, North American, or Commonwealth constitution. And this may strike you as a surprising claim, even a counterintuitive one. I know we have no formal separation of powers, and I know that formally the United Kingdom is not a federal country. But nonetheless, our constitutional order is as informed and inspired by the ideas that animate the separation of powers and federalism as any other. Consider the two biggest changes to the constitutional order in the last quarter century. They are surely the changing dynamic in the relationship between parliamentary government and the courts, and the emergence and development of devolved government in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. A newly empowered judiciary, or with more historical accuracy, a newly re-empowered judiciary, and a newly devolved landscape in three of the United Kingdom's four home nations have transformed our constitution. One is driven by ideas associated with the separation of powers, the other by ideas associated with federalism and multi-layered government. The separation of powers divides and shares powers across different functions of government. Federalism and devolution divide and share power across different levels of government. One, if you like, is a horizontal sharing of power. The other is a vertical sharing of power. Now, I think I've talked more than enough about generalities. Let me turn to some specifics. And let me try to illustrate my argument with two recent examples, each of which has been spawned in its own way by Brexit. That is, by the constitutional dramas generated by the handling and the mishandling of the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. The first example will be well known to all of you. It is the Supreme Court judgments in the two Miller cases. The second example is perhaps less well known, but every bit as important. It is the UK Internal Market Bill, currently in the House of Lords. So let me start with Miller. Both of the Miller judgments were about the separation of powers. In the first, the Supreme Court ruled by majority that the United Kingdom government could not lawfully give notice of the UK's formal intention to withdraw from the European Union under Article 50 of the Treaty on the European Union under its prerogative or existing statutory powers. In order to trigger Article 50, ministers needed clear, bespoke authority conferred by an Act of Parliament, the court ruled. In the second, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the executive had acted unlawfully in seeking to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks. The prerogative power of prorogation did not extend, the court ruled, to an ability on the part of the executive to obstruct Parliament's constitutional functions of making legislation and holding ministers to account. Both judgments safeguarded Parliament's place in the constitutional order, in both instances protecting Parliament from encroachment by executive powers. And seen in this light, which is of course very much the light in which the Supreme Court wanted at least its second decision to be seen, the decisions join a much lauded line of authority going back to the 17th century, in which the courts have made much of their role as guardians of Parliament and bulwarks against expanded use of the royal prerogative. The case of proclamations in 1611, Attorney General of the Keys' Royal Hotel in 1920, and Ex parte Fire Brigades Union in 1995 are all rather proudly cited by the Supreme Court in its judgment in the second Miller case. My point this evening is not to get into the argument about whether the Supreme Court was right or wrong in its verdicts in the two Miller cases. That ground has been worked thoroughly enough. My point is to reflect on what the two cases tell us about sovereignty the nature of power, and how it is shared and separated. The first case was caused by complete constitutional confusion about what, if anything, was actually decided on the 23rd of June 2016. Clearly, a question was asked on that day: should the United Kingdom remain a member state of the European Union, or should it leave the European Union? And that question was answered: we should leave. The question, of course, was asked in a referendum legislated for by Act of Parliament, and the answer was given by the electorate. But what constitutional authority did the answer carry? What constitutional weight did it bear? Did the referendum decide anything? And if so, was the decision binding? If it was binding, on whom? And the confusion was caused by constitutional law and political reality, each offering very different answers to these questions. Legally, the referendum decided nothing and bound no one. But politically, the referendum was not the expression of an opinion that the UK might withdraw from the EU. It was an authoritative and decisive instruction to leave. And from the morning of the 24th of June, it became the job of parliamentary government to ensure that the people's instruction was implemented and followed. And that David Cameron did not feel able to undertake this task is the reason he announced that day that he would resign as the United Kingdom's Prime Minister. Thereafter, it soon became apparent that the task of delivering the referendum result was more enthusiastically embraced by the executive branch than by Parliament itself. A majority of members in both Houses of Parliament had wanted a Remain vote in the referendum, but it quickly became government policy that leave meant leave and Brexit meant Brexit, whether we liked it or not. And this put government and Parliament at loggerheads, never a happy position in a constitutional order in which the government of the day depends for its legitimacy, not on the support of the electorate directly, but on the confidence and supply of the House of Commons. And that the governing party then lost its narrow Commons majority in the ensuing general election only made matters all the more fraught. Now, we all know this story, and I need not labour it any further. But something interesting happens when you refract it through the prism of ideas associated with the separation of powers. The separation of powers, as we've come to understand it, is a modern doctrine, that the powers of the state should be divided into a legislative, an executive, and a judicial branch, and that each of these functions should be undertaken by different people and bodies, is an 18th century idea fathered by Montesquieu and Madison. But in the minds of these men, it was fashioned out of much older ideas, ideas that could be traced all the way back to Aristotle. For the ancients, there were three modes of rule: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Rule by the one, rule by the few, and rule by the many. In classical political thought, it was seen that each of these modes of rule could be either virtuous or corrupt. Monarchy could become tyranny. Aristocracy could corrode into oligarchy, and democracy could collapse into mob rule. And these were not theoretical worries. Throughout history, a pattern could be discerned where this happened over and again. A monarch would become a despot. A privileged few, an educated and wealthy class, would rise up against the tyrant and overthrow him. These few would rule wisely for a while, but in time their self-interest would descend into oligarchy, whereupon the people would revolt, democratic government would prevail for a time, but this too would corrode and collapse into mob rule. And then a strong leader would emerge out of the chaos and impose order once more, and the cycle would start over, destined to be repeated over and over again. There was one way, however, in which this cycle of destruction and instability could be stopped. If a constitution mixed or fused elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy together, then none of the three would be permitted by the other two to corrode or collapse into its dark side. The monarch would be restrained and could not become a tyrant. The aristocracy's interests would be balanced against those of the monarch and the demos, meaning that the few could not rule only in their own narrow self-interests. And the demos would be checked by strong leadership and wise counsel, preventing it from collapsing into mob rule. Stable government, then, was possible. It could be delivered under a constitution that mixed and combined elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And this was the theory of the mixed constitution, an old idea out of which the men of the Enlightenment fashioned our more modern notion of the separation of powers. Now, I like the idea of the mixed constitution. I like it a lot. Indeed, I like it rather more than I like the modern separation of powers. And when you consider the Supreme Court's judgment in the first Miller case, in the light of the old idea of the mixed constitution, that judgment takes on a new and, to my mind, rather attractive hue. The referendum was the verdict of the people, for sure, but stable government requires that the verdict of the people is blended with sound leadership and wise counsel. In order to maintain stability and good governance, the power of the demos needs to be mixed with the other modes of rule. It should not be allowed to rule alone. And this is one of the key problems, it seems to me, of referendums. They upset that balance of interests that makes for more stable government. They encourage us to see the verdict of the people not as one element in a complex and compound system of government, but as the only element that matters, as a trump card. Now, for better or for worse, we seem to have reached the point in our country's development where there are some constitutional changes that can now occur only with a referendum. No one seriously proposes, for example, that Scotland could become independent of the United Kingdom without an independence referendum. We need to be much more honest with ourselves, however, about the limits of referendums. For the experience of both the 2014 Scottish independence referendum and the 2016 Brexit referendum is that referendums do not resolve very much. The question of what constitutional relations Scotland should have with the rest of the United Kingdom was not settled for a generation, if not for a lifetime, in 2014, despite SNP promises to that effect. And the question of what trading arrangements the United Kingdom should have with the European Union was not resolved in the Brexit referendum of 2016. These questions vex Scottish and British politics and continue to determine and to shape party political fortunes and allegiances, even in a time when a global health emergency dominates most of the front pages. What happened after 2016 was that one branch of government, the executive branch, claimed for itself the mantle of representing and delivering the people's verdict, as if that was the only thing that mattered, forgetting that in a balanced constitution, other interests are required by the constitution itself, to be taken into account. And this is another of the key problems with referendums. They encourage and accelerate that collapse of democracy into populism, and they generate a more authoritarian style of government. What the Supreme Court was trying to do in both the Miller cases was to re-inject into our constitution a sense of balance. And this ought to appeal to conservatives, one might have thought, despite the fact that it was a conservative government that lost both cases. Conservatives are supposed to be interested in stability, in order, in the principles and practices of sound, prudent government. The ancients have much to teach us about these matters. If we look under the skin of the modern doctrine of the separation of powers, we will find much learning about how constitutions best secure that sense of balance, of stability, of order that conservatives yearn for. And we achieve it not by hoarding power, but by sharing it. We secure it not by doing as if the verdict of the people somehow trumps all other considerations, but by blending that verdict into public policy and into courses of action that can be supported by all the forces of the state. I want to move towards the second example I wanted to share with you this evening, which is the UK internal Market Bill. And this is a bill that touches directly on the United Kingdom's devolution settlement. The UK's devolution statutes, often referred to as our devolution settlement, are based on a number of assumptions. And the most significant was that the United Kingdom would remain a member state of the European Union. This assumption saved the architects of devolution from having to answer questions which would otherwise have been very difficult, questions which have now arisen and which require thoughtful and not knee-jerk answers. The devolved administrations are all of limited competence. The governments and parliaments created by the Scotland Acts, the Government of Wales Acts, and the Northern Ireland Acts have limited legislative and executive competence, the limits being set in the devolution statutes. None of the devolved administrations can make law on matters reserved to Westminster. None of them can make law incompatible with convention rights, and none can make law contrary to EU law. And this last restriction falls away upon Brexit and needs to be carefully recrafted to meet the new circumstances that prevail now that we have withdrawn from the European Union. Until now, the United Kingdom has not had to worry about the devolved administrations exercising powers in a manner that disrupts or interferes with trade in goods and services within the United Kingdom. This is not because the devolved administrations lack powers in the area of economic regulation. It is because the exercise of such powers has been required by law to be compatible with European law. And this means that devolved competence has had to be exercised within the constraints of European single market law on the free movement of goods and services. Let's take a well-known example. In 2012, the Scottish Parliament legislated to impose a minimum unit price on alcohol sales in Scotland. And this was designed as a public health measure addressed as a means of seeking to combat Scotland's long-standing problem relationship with alcohol abuse. The Scotch Whisky Association and others challenged the lawfulness of the measure in the courts, but the Court of Justice and the UK Supreme Court ruled that it was not a disproportionate interference with the free movement of goods and fell within the scope of the Scottish Parliament's lawmaking powers. Of course, imposing a minimum unit price on a product interferes with the free movement of that product. It is a constraint or a condition imposed on the sale of the product. But the courts found that the interference was lawful because it was a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate policy objective. It was proportionate to the end of seeking to improve public health. Now, after the end of the transition period, it will cease to be a requirement of our law that the devolved administrations act compatibly with EU law. For the first time, therefore, there will be nothing to stop the devolved administrations exercising their powers such that trade in goods and services within the United Kingdom is disrupted. This is a significant change because until now, the application within the United Kingdom of European single market law has ensured that devolved powers over economic regulation, consumer protection, product safety, and the like have not been able to be exercised in such a manner as undermines or interferes with the integrity of our own internal market. Once we have left the transition period, however, this safeguard falls away. And as the law stands, from January next year, there will be nothing to stop the devolved administrations imposing conditions on products or services in the devolved nations, even if those conditions have the effect of undermining market access across the United Kingdom. This matters. One of the principal benefits of union, and of course one of the main reasons why the union between England and Scotland was first entered into in 1707, was to allow Scottish traders free and unfettered access to English markets. This is not only a historical benefit of the union. Even now, Scotland trades more than 3 times as much with the rest of the United Kingdom as it does with the whole of the European Union. The economic case for union is the strongest argument we unionists have against the separatists in the Scottish National Party who seek to break it up. And at the very core of that argument is unimpeded market access. Hence the UK Internal Market Bill, introduced by Boris Johnson's government in September, and passed by the House of Commons in October. That bill, as I said a few moments ago, is now in the House of Lords. And the bill has attracted attention because of provisions in it which have the potential to put the United Kingdom in breach of obligations it entered into with the European Union in the withdrawal agreement. But it is another part of the bill on which I want to focus my remarks this evening. And let me say straight away that I enthusiastically welcome the policy intention underlying this bill. The devolved United Kingdom needs legislation to undergird and protect the integrity of its internal market in goods and services now that we have left the European Union. Indeed, I first made the argument that we needed such legislation even before Brexit, back in 2015. But a number of the means adopted in the bill to achieve this end are flawed, and they should be modified before the bill is enacted into law. This is because, as introduced, the bill fails to offer sufficient protection to devolution. And for those of us dedicated to preserving Scotland's place in the United Kingdom, this ought to be of real concern. Whatever we might have thought of it when it was introduced by the Blair government in 1997, devolution is hugely popular in Scotland. Attacking it or undermining it will only harm and hinder the argument that Scotland's future lies in the United Kingdom and not as an independent state. In the devolved United Kingdom, economic or regulatory divergence between the UK's four nations should not be outlawed unless that divergence is so great that it undermines the integrity or effective operation of the UK's internal market itself. This is how the European single market works, and it's how the UK's internal market should work too. To return to the example I used a few moments ago, minimum unit pricing for the sale of alcohol is an example of regulatory divergence. But it was found not to be so disproportionate an interference with the integrity of the market that it was unlawful. As introduced, by contrast, the UK Internal Market Bill provided that any requirement created by a devolved administration after the bill comes into force that would impede the operation of the UK internal market will have no effect. This would have been the case irrespective of the importance of the public interest, which the devolved administration was seeking to protect, and irrespective of how small or trivial the impediment is to the operation of the UK internal market. Now, during its passage through the House of Commons, the bill was amended to soften this rule to some degree. A condition imposed on the manner of sale of a good or product will not now fall foul of this rule unless it is so disproportionate that it threatens the integrity of the market itself. This puts beyond doubt that devolved measures such as minimum unit pricing for the sale of alcohol will be lawful post-Brexit, just as they were pre-Brexit. This is a welcome amendment, but it does not go far enough. The explanatory notes accompanying the bill give the following example. Under the bill, a packet of crisps made in one part of the United Kingdom that met the relevant requirements in that part could be sold in any other part of the United Kingdom without having to meet any other relevant requirements that apply there. That's an example that's used to illustrate what the UK Internal Market Bill will do in the bill's explanatory notes. So let's just explore the implications of that example for the devolved United Kingdom. Suppose that the Scottish Parliament wanted to legislate to reduce salt in crisps, so that crisps in Scotland could be sold only if they met new, lower maximum thresholds of salt content. At the moment, Holyrood could do that as long as it was proportionate to public health, compatibly with EU single market laws. But under the bill, Holyrood will lose this power. Crisps manufactured in Scotland would have to meet the new, tougher maximum threshold of salt content, but crisps manufactured in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland and sold in Scotland would not, because Scotland could not impose any new requirement on goods lawfully made in the other three home nations. So the effect of the bill is that Scottish goods and services will still be subject to Scottish regulations in devolved areas, but the Scottish government will not be able to exclude legal goods or services from the rest of the UK, no matter how you cut it. This is a clear incursion into existing devolved competence. It's easily fixed. As in EU law, a list of the reasons why a devolved administration may impose a new restriction on goods or services needs to be set out in the bill, for example, public health, consumer protection, and the like. And the bill needs then to be amended to provide that it will not be unlawful for a devolved administration to impose new requirements for those reasons, as long as the requirements are necessary in the public interest. Closely related to this matter, there is no ability in the bill for the devolved administrations to protect themselves from the lowering of standards in another part of the UK. Let's go back to crisps. Suppose that the UK Parliament legislates to provide that crisps may be manufactured, distributed, and sold in England, irrespective of their salt content. Suppose that the Scottish Parliament considers this to be contrary to public health in Scotland and wishes to maintain current rules about maximum salt content in crisps. Under the bill as it stands, Holyrood would be unable to do this. Holyrood will have to allow a product lawfully made in England to be sold in Scotland, because in the future, the Scottish Parliament will be unable to impose any further restrictions or requirements. So if it's good enough for England, it will have to be good enough for Scotland too. Now that would be fine if there were a statutory flaw providing in law for minimum standards. There are informal common frameworks providing for agreed minimum standards, and there are political commitments from UK ministers that our current high standards will be maintained. But there is nothing to enforce any of that, and there is no legal guarantee that ensures it. A final issue arising in relation to this bill is that it provides for the matters I've been discussing to be monitored and regulated by the Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA, in particular by a new Office of the Internal Market, or OIM, to be established within the CMA. Thus, the CMA will play a role in the future broadly analogous to the role played now by the European Commission. The other half of the enforcement equation, however, is missing. There appears to be no room for the courts to enforce the principles of the UK internal market. Indeed, clause 1(3), if I've understood it correctly, appears expressly to exclude this possibility by providing that the market access principles are to have no direct legal effect, except as provided by the bill. This raises two questions. First, why exclude the courts? And secondly, if the courts are to be excluded, that makes the role of the CMA all the more important. So who's on the CMA and how do they get there? What voice will the devolved administrations have in deciding who serves on the CMA? The European Commission includes members from across the member states. Will the CMA's Office of the Internal Market have a like composition, ensuring representation from all four of the UK's home nations? Where legitimate regional policy divergence over matters of economic regulation ends, and where equally legitimate national concern over the integrity of an internal market starts, is a very hard question. It stress tests even the world's most mature and sophisticated federal jurisdictions. Witness, as just one example, the controversies that bedevil the Commerce Clause of the US Constitution. It is a question which the original architects of devolution in the UK did not have to address in our devolution statutes because EU law answered it for them. And to get this matter right requires statecraft. The integrity of the UK's internal market is more vulnerable post-Brexit than it was before we withdrew from the European Union. The government is right to want to legislate to fix that. But at the same time, legislating to fix that problem in a manner that goes too far to impose a one-size-fits-all solution on the devolved United Kingdom risks the future of the Union itself. As I said a few moments ago, irrespective of where we stood in 1997, the reality 2 and a bit decades on is that devolution is a necessary and inevitable part of the United Kingdom. Undermine it, and you risk undermining the Union itself. Preparing for this lecture, I reread Maurice Byles' classic work, Constitutionalism and the Separation of Powers, first published in 1967. In it, he traces the intellectual history and practical development of the separation of powers in the United Kingdom, the United States, and France. He notes that this once revolutionary idea in time became a bulwark of conservatism. And he laments the fact that there have always been those in Britain who reject the separation of powers. Too many people in Britain, Wirral wrote, do not understand the idea of a constitution which limits and superintends the operation of the legislature, unquote. There are those who think that Brexit was necessary in order to return sovereignty to Parliament, and that leaving the European Union means that we can now revert to the Constitution of 1972. These sovereigntists, as I shall call them, resent not only the verdicts of the Supreme Court in the two Miller cases, but they resent the very fact that the Supreme Court was involved at all. And they seem to think that Brexit can be superimposed over the realities of devolution with no cost at all to the integrity of the United Kingdom's union state. They are profoundly wrong. 50 years ago, Maurice Wirral wrote these words, and they ring ever more true. The separation of powers remains, he said, a central problem in the English political system. For the problem of the controlled exercise of power is still, and probably always will be, the critical aspect of a system of government which hopes to combine efficiency with the greatest possible exercise of personal freedom. The basic problem remains, in spite of all the changes since the 17th century. If our system is to remain essentially a system of government by law, then some form of control must be exercised over the agents of government. If we abandon this philosophy of law, how do we prevent mere expediency from degenerating into arbitrary government? Not the arbitrary rule of a Charles I, a Cromwell, or a Hitler, but the arbitrariness of a great machine staffed by well-intentioned men possessing of necessity a limited range of vision and a limited ability to judge where a succession of expedient decisions will lead. Those are Wirral's words, not mine. I'm going to finish this evening almost where I started. Same author, different play. A fearsome, bloodied, but successful Coriolanus returns to Rome from the battlefield, where he has led his men to another in a long line of famous military victories. He is to become consul. He has the support of the Senate, but custom dictates that he needs also to solicit the voice of the people. Ordinarily, this would be a matter of course, a mere formality, but Coriolanus holds the people in contempt. He is prevailed upon to seek their voice, but he does it reluctantly and cannot hide his disdain for the whole process. The tribunes of the people, jealous to safeguard the people's voice, are quick to spot Coriolanus's contempt and whip up the mob to deny Coriolanus their voice. He overreacts, matters escalate, to the point where Coriolanus is accused of treachery and is banished. He joins Rome's old enemies and returns once more in battle, seeking vengeance against those who banished him. At the 11th hour, his mother intercedes and persuades him to sue for peace, albeit on terms that suit Rome's enemies more than Rome herself. Outraged, however, by being denied their chance to sack Rome, these enemies turn on Coriolanus, ambush him, and put him to the sword. Often described as Shakespeare's most political play, Coriolanus is all about what happens when the mixed constitution goes wrong. A great campaigner does not necessarily a great leader make. Political leadership is about sharing power. It's about ruling by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. It's about seeking the people's voice and maintaining their support, not only in one part of the country, but throughout it. In short, a good leader will stoop and humble his intents to others' well-practiced, wise directions. And the bold, just, and impartial spirit of a good constitution will ensure that that is exactly how government must work. Thank you very much.
Well, that was fascinating. And thank you very, very much indeed, Adam, for what I think is a really profoundly thoughtful and wonderfully lucid and erudite lecture. It's been recorded, of course, for our website, and I hope it gets a great deal of attention beyond simply those of us who've had the privilege of listening to it tonight. So we're very grateful to you. we do have some questions, if you're okay with that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
What we've done, as usual, as Ed said at the beginning, is if you sort of type them into the chat function, then I'll do my best to read them out and tell you who they came from. And we've got, I think, till about 8 o'clock. So let's kick off. This is from Ronan Cormacane. He says, if, as Professor Tomkins suggests, sovereignty is a gift, then who gives it?
Mm-hmm.
Would this mean that the ultimate source of sovereignty is not the crown, nor parliament, but the people themselves? Not something in harmony with orthodox UK constitutional jurisprudence. So who gives the gift of sovereignty?
Well, that is an extraordinarily good question and difficult one to start with. So thanks very much for that. There is a view in Scotland that is quite close to this idea of popular sovereignty, but it's not a view that's ever been taken seriously by any source of English law. The sovereignty of Parliament in English law, and I think in the broader British Constitution, comes from an understanding that when the two highest authorities in the Constitution act together, when you've got the House of Commons and House of Lords on the one hand, and the Crown on the other, formally coming together to agree an instrument called a statute, there can in law and logic be no higher authority than that. So in that sense, the sovereignty of Parliament is not the legislative supremacy of statute, as I would prefer to call it, is not a gift. It's almost a matter of logic. It's like saying, well, if sovereignty didn't rest here, if supremacy didn't rest here, there is nowhere else it could rest. So therefore, it must rest here. There is and never has been any sort of well-developed jurisprudence or practice in the British Constitution of popular sovereignty. And the mixed constitution was devised by theorists and by jurists to oppose the idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty does as if that value of democracy can and should trump the values and practices and institutions of monarchy and aristocracy. And the mixed constitution, on which I think the British Constitution has always been based and is still based, says no. There are three modes of rule here, and they must all be harnessed, they must all be used, and no one of them can be allowed to trump the other two. So I think for that reason, we reject the idea of popular sovereignty. Democracy in the British Constitution has a place, of course it does, but it also has its limits.
Okay, so the gift is not one that comes from any one particular place, for the sound of it.
Yeah, I think it comes from 800 years of history, doesn't it? I mean, and it comes from, in particular, it comes from the resolution of the bloodiest and most difficult period of that history, which was the 17th century. If you want a legal source, then it's in the Bill of Rights and the Act of Settlement, which are the two most foundational constitutional documents that we've got.
Okay, that's great. That's very helpful. Great. My old friend Keith Best. Question. Parliamentary sovereignty enables Parliament, in brackets, in our system, says Keith, very much largely controlled by the executive as a constituent element within the legislature, parenthesis, to change any law by which the courts may have adjudicated that the executive acted ultra vires, or to attack or curtail the judicial function by which that was determined, by judicial review. With recent examples of this occurrence, is it time for the UK to have a Grundgesetz, that's my bad pronunciation, my German, but basically a basic law against which such legislation should be judged?
No, I've never been attracted to the idea that if you write something down and codify it, that you necessarily stop these squabbles from happening. So no, I don't actually think it would help. I think what would help is a sense that no matter how politically important, we're all Democrats. When we decide in our legislation to ask the people a question in a referendum, of course, we have got to listen to the answer. But we've got to, at the same time, understand that that answer needs to be refracted. It needs to be delivered through the ordinary institutions of governance. And that no matter how important, it isn't and cannot be allowed to be a trump card. There is no room for trump cards in the British Constitution, properly understood. I suppose that would be another way of expressing what I've tried to say this evening. And the problem, I think, with the German idea of the Grundgesetz, or some kind of basic or foundational law, is that it freezes what should be an ongoing iterative process in a particular document and in a particular time. And you know, if we didn't do that when Magna Carta was signed, and if we didn't do that in the 17th century, and if we didn't do that in the Act of Settlement, then why should we do it now?
Yeah, okay, that's I certainly have a lot of sympathy with that view. I think when you look to America, how the rigidity of the written constitution has actually been perhaps an obstacle to
yeah, I mean, the US Constitution is a wonderful instrument in all sorts of ways, and there's much to learn from it and admire in it. But the only way in which the US Constitution can be easily changed is by the Supreme Court, which is why appointments to the Supreme Court have become so politicized, because ultimately, you know, the question of what should be in your constitution is a political question. Yeah. The question of whether Scotland should have devolution or not is a political question. The question of what should the relationship be between a verdict of the Supreme Court and the ability of Parliament to overturn that verdict by legislation is a political question. And the idea that you, just by handing that question over to a group of 9 or 11 justices, that it ceases thereby to be political, is, I think, for the birds. I mean, we witness yet again this week events in Washington as President Trump's nominee is subject not to legal interrogation about her views of what the Constitution means, but to political interrogation by those who disagree with her on the politics of abortion.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when I chair the Justice Committee, the one thing I don't ever want added into my job description is having to chair hearings like that. That's for sure.
Absolutely. Well, I have the equivalent job in the Scottish Parliament. I'm the convener of the Justice Committee in the Scottish Parliament, and you know, if there were, God forbid, ever an independent Scotland, we would have a written constitution, and we would have to wrestle with all of these questions. And I don't find that an attractive prospect at all.
Absolutely not. No, we're at one there. Another question from Harry Malik. After we leave the EU, are there any plans to allow individuals to have their rights guaranteed across the UK, including Scotland, by allowing appeals to the Supreme Court on human rights matters? Also, says Harry, to allow applications as individuals rather than having to seek leave to appeal from the Scottish courts, maybe that Haroon's in Scotland himself.
I don't know that leaving the European Union will make any material difference to rights of appeal on human rights grounds. I think that's contained in the Human Rights Act, dealt with in the Human Rights Act, or for Scotland in the Scotland Act. And I don't think that that's going to make any difference. What, as a matter of law, what Brexit means, of course, is that the way in which the norms and principles of European law are enforced and practiced by the courts in the United Kingdom will change. And we won't notice very much of that change to start with, because of the effect of the legislation that was passed by the United Kingdom Parliament in 2018 to retain the effect of most substantive EU law, at least in the short term. But it won't affect rights of appeal in that sense, and it won't affect human rights matters, I don't think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And of course, human rights matters, as well as the provision under the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, nonetheless there remains our position within the ECHR and our adherence to the Strasbourg Court and its jurisdiction, which of course would be unchanged.
Yeah, absolutely. And the most important human rights instrument that we have is the Human Rights Act, which is an act of the United Kingdom Parliament, which the courts use to navigate their way through the jurisprudence of the Strasbourg Court. And again, that's an iterative process, and there are those who think that the UK courts have gone too far in borrowing from Strasbourg jurisprudence and in accommodating that Strasbourg jurisprudence within the fabric of our own legal system. And there are those who think that the courts have got it about right. That is a question which is perfectly appropriate for the government to ask itself, and indeed others, and to review from time to time. We've had, what is it now, 20 years of experience of the Human Rights Act being enforced, and it is appropriate that we review it and learn lessons from that experience.
Yeah, I agree. Question from Guy Sandhurst. If the government of the day drives through legislation, such as, say, the right to abolish habeas corpus, or else jurisdiction to review regulation, do the courts have any entitlement to qualify or override such legislation?
Oh, that's the kind of impossible question that I like to ask my first-year students. Yeah, I mean, it's unresolved, isn't it? I mean, there are increasingly powerful dicta from the top court, from a number of justices, that would strongly suggest that they would be minded to rule, if a future case arose, that there are limits to the extent to which the common law will observe the supremacy over it of statute. And if statute does remove rights which have been so fundamental to English constitutional fabric for so long as habeas corpus or the right to trial by jury, that without providing good reason for doing so, that there are common lawyers out there, including at the top court, who would be prepared to exercise their authority in such a way as to say, well, these are limits to parliamentary sovereignty. Whether that is a majority position in the Supreme Court at the moment or a minority position in the Supreme Court at the moment, we don't know, because it hasn't been tested. The best answer to that question is that Parliament shouldn't enact legislation that abolishes habeas corpus, or that abolishes the right to trial by jury, or that abolishes judicial review. Of course, Parliament has the right, every right, to keep all of these matters under review, to legislate on any of these matters. Parliament has legislated on the scope of judicial review before, and if Parliament wants to legislate again on the scope of judicial review to clarify what is meant by standing to seek judicial review, for example, to clarify what to clarify the speed with which applications or petitions in Scotland for judicial review should be brought, these procedural matters are completely within Parliament's ambit, and there should be no go area for Parliament to consider in terms of how it wants to legislate on the subject of judicial review. But at the same time, I don't think it would be in anybody's interests for there to be a clash between where Parliament wants to take the law of judicial review and where the courts want to take it. The solution to these issues is for practices to be worked out in harmony and in tandem, rather than at loggerheads.
Yeah, back to your point in the lectures about those in power using a bit of judgment.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should. Yeah. Yeah, no,
indeed, that would be another very neat summary of what I was trying to say.
It's a very good point, right. One from Liam Kerr. He says, excellent lecture, absolutely agree, Liam. If it is accepted that the three houses, as in inverted commas, of monarchy, aristocracy, and demos, is the phrase that Liam's used, ensure appropriate checks on each other to prevent anyone going rotten, and is thus a mixed constitution is the ideal, does that suggest a unicameral parliament will ultimately be unable or unlikely to be so checked? Jesse?
Well, Liam is a colleague of mine in the Scottish Parliament, and we are both members, of course, of a unicameral parliament. But the difference between the legislation that we pass as MSPs and the legislation that you pass as members of the House of Commons and members of the House of Lords in Westminster is that our legislation is not supreme. So my answer to Liam's question would be that the reason why acts of the Scottish Parliament can be quashed in the courts, whereas acts of the UK Parliament cannot be quashed in the UK courts, is precisely because we don't have the checks and balances within our lawmaking process in Holyrood that our friends and colleagues in Westminster enjoy or endure on a daily basis. So we have different checks and balances in with regard to devolved legislation because our Parliament is unicameral. The last thing I would say about bicameralism in Scotland is that, you know, bicameralism in Scotland would mean that we would need a second chamber for the Scottish Parliament. I think I will offend no one if I say the last thing Scotland needs is more politicians.
There's a fair point, but I must say that we had a debate in Westminster Hall today, actually, initiated by Joanna Cherry, about the Lord Chancellor's oath and the rule of law. And I rather wish that it had been tomorrow, because I could have used some of the parts of the lecture more eruditely than I did. But that's a good point. Any more questions for Adam? Got a bit of time if people want to type swiftly. If not, perhaps I can pose this one then as we go forward. Adam, you rightly posited some of the potential tensions around the UK Internal Markets Bill, and it's something that I've had a certain amount to do with over the last few weeks. And part of this debate that we had today was the assertion that the very existence of the clauses in Part 5 of the bill itself constitutes an act of bad faith and a breach of our international legal obligations. Seemed to me, and I think it's the view of the government, certainly for the Lord Chancellor, that that's stretching it too far, and that there are certain circumstances in which it might be permissible to use them if certain tests are met. But there's a danger sometimes, is there perhaps that increasingly we make assertions in the political discourse around legal matters as if they are established fact, whereas in fact, as you've observed, even on things like the idea of some basic fundamental aspects of common law, which can trump Parliament. There's a debate between, say, the Johann Steins and Barbara Hales on one side, and the late Tom Bingham's on the other, as far as I can see. And like you, I'm not sure where they will go either, if it came to it.
Yeah, indeed. So, I mean, the fuss about part of the problem with the fuss about the rule of law in the context of the clauses in the Internal Market Bill that touch on is used with even more imprecision than the sovereignty of Parliament or the separation of powers. And that's one of the reasons why I didn't talk about it in my lecture this evening, because before you talk about it, you have to define it, and defining it can take an awfully long time. But as a constitutional principle, the rule of law really only means one thing, and it's relatively simple. And that is that before the government may do anything, it requires legal authority. So we have a government of law, not a government of arbitrary whim. So the rule of law question with regard to what Brandon Lewis said at Dispatch Box, which caused so much of the controversy a few weeks ago, is: do ministers of the Crown have the legal authority to introduce into Parliament a bill which, if enacted, might place the Crown in breach of a number of its international treaty obligations recently entered into with the European Union? And the answer to that question is emphatically yes. Of course, ministers of the Crown have that power. And in that sense, Bob, and I think that's the crucial sense, in that sense, there was nothing in what Brandon Lewis said or did. There was nothing in what the government did in introducing that bill into the House of Commons that was in breach of the rule of law, if you understand the rule of law in that sort of constitutional sense. Now, I know that there is more to the rule of law than that, but that's its core, that's its fundamental, and the core and the fundamental of the rule of law was not even touched, never mind violated, by the actions of the government in introducing that legislation into Parliament. Is there such a thing as the rule of international law? Well, there is in legal theory, but that legal theory quickly runs into the reality. It's a bit like the legal theory of a referendum deciding nothing. Now, we all know that that's true as a matter of law and nonsense. At the same time, we all know that the people decided in June 2016 that we'll leave the European Union, irrespective of the legal status in constitutional theory of the referendum decision. So that you can have something which is true in legal theory, but still not really very useful and doesn't take you very far. And I think the thing to hold on to is the core and the fundament of the rule of law, which is an absolutely inviolable principle, which is that the courts will rightly require that before the government does anything, it has clear, direct legal authority to do that thing which it's seeking to do.
Fair point. Well, we seem to set a chord here about the position of the Crown for some reason. And I've got a couple of questions that we might as well link together here, if that's it. One from Robert Craig, who again says, thanks for an excellent lecture. Does Professor Tomkins think that ministers advising the Crown could advise the Crown to refuse royal assent? Interesting how that might arise. Then Keith Best comes back and says, what's the likelihood of the Queen declaring la reine s'avisera if Parliament sought to abolish the monarchy, for example? Well, that would be a novel one. I'd rather think personally, but
on Robert Craig's question,
what do you think?
I think that the answer to that must be more doubtful after the second Miller case, after the was unlawful. I think that the Supreme Court insisted, I don't think it was particularly convincing, but the Supreme Court insisted that what it was doing in the second Miller case was ruling not on the exercise of prerogative powers, but on the extent of prerogative powers. The Supreme Court might therefore think that it has the jurisdiction, it does have the jurisdiction, to rule on the extent to which ministers have the power to advise Her Majesty to refuse royal assent. If that power was being exercised in a manner that sought to obstruct Parliament in the execution of its constitutional duties, then you would have to think that following Miller and Cherry, the court would at least entertain the argument that it had the jurisdiction to rule in those terms. But it would be fact specific, it would be fact dependent, and the court would want to think about the extent of the ministerial power to advise Her Majesty to withhold assent and the reasons why that power is being exercised, which would vary from case to case. Again, the best answer to these questions is let's not ask them. The best answer to these questions is let's ensure that ministers have arguments which persuade Parliament to legislate in manners which ministers want to say should represent the law of the land.
Yep, absolutely right. Totally so. There's about 3 more questions. I'll save up to the end from Bill Bowman, but there's one here from Robert Craig again, and he's coming back to this question of ousting the jurisdiction of the courts over inferior bodies. Do you, Adam, think that would be acceptable if there were instead? That's the bell for the adjournment. Nothing else. It will go off in a second. My predecessor, Eric Forth, who some of you know, had a habit of ringing people up at 10 o'clock at night to prove he was still working, in certain knowledge that the bell will go at 10. After about 5 minutes, he could say, "Well, I've got to go now." We don't have to do that here. But anyway, so what Robert was saying was, if there was an alternative judicial route of review, not sure what Robert has in mind by that. This will be a substantial difference from excluding judicial review of executive power, would it not? Or would it be, to my mind, would it be the same thing by another name, really?
I don't know what the hypothetical is that Robert has in mind there, but Robert, if you can still hear us, then just email me that one, and we'll I'll get back to you. But the cases I was speaking about this evening were cases that did not involve inferior bodies; they involved Parliament. And what the Supreme Court was trying to do in both of the Miller cases, it seems to me, was to ensure that the executive could not use its prerogative powers in such a way as either to sideline Parliament in the first case or to obstruct Parliament in the second case. And I did studiously seek to avoid declaring whether I thought that those decisions were rightly decided or wrongly decided, rightly reasoned or wrongly reasoned. I'm just trying to think about what they tell us about the nature of power in the modern British Constitution and how it is separated and shared. And I think that the attitude of the courts in administrative cases that deal with inferior bodies is likely to be different, and probably should, well, not probably, it should be different from the attitude of the courts in high constitutional cases that involve the what you might call the prerogatives of Parliament.
Yeah, okay, fair point. Thanks. Yeah. Two, one from Ronan, another one from Ronan Corncanan. I see that Robert says he's going to email you, Adam, on that one, so it's coming to you.
Yeah, I thought he would.
You know him well, I can see. Ronan says again, thank you for the lecture. Just a reference to a case on trade and devolution from Northern Ireland in the 1930s. Milk trade across the borders. It's a case called Gallagher and Lynn.
Oh, yes.
Come across it, you obviously have.
Yeah.
And that was, I think, leisure of consequence of the Stormont Parliament. And does it that's relevant to the points we were talking about around internal trade in the UK, in the current context?
That's a good question. I don't know what the answer to that is without rereading it. And I haven't read that case for a long time, but that's one of the cases where I think the Privy Council talked about pith and substance, which was a test which used to be used and isn't used anymore to determine the scope of legislative competence. I haven't thought about that in the context of trade, but thank you for that tip, and I will go away and have a think about that and reflect on it.
And Tom Spencer asked me to repeat it. It's called Gallagher and Lynn, L-Y-L-L-N, and it's from the 1930s, and it's a Northern Ireland case. I think we've got that now, Tom. And maybe, since we've got one more question left, and we're coming perhaps towards the end. Oh, it was one new message somebody wants to get in quickly. Let me see if there's something here. No, I think that's it. Here's one from Bill Bowman, who says, did those in the past from whom we might learn have more time to think and evolve their thinking than we do in the modern age with instant news and social media? Well, it's a nice philosophic point upon which to end. I think Harold Macmillan might have rather had sympathy with that than others.
Well, they might have had more time to think, but they certainly had fewer opportunities to broadcast what they were thinking. And I don't know that I would want to sacrifice the opportunities that we all have now to broadcast our thinking in order to buy a little more time. It's a bit of a trade-off, isn't it? We're all bombarded by a blizzard of email and social media, but you can always mute it and you can always switch it off. And especially this year, with lockdown and everything that's come with it, we have had a bit more time to think and reflect, haven't we? And I think that all of us are puzzling away, aren't we, about the extent to which in the new normal, if I can use that phrase, we'll want to take with us bits of 2020 and not rush back to the pace and frenetic sense of life that we had in the years leading up to it. But that's a question that each of us will be able to work out with our whips in due course.
There's a thought, yes. We couldn't get through the evening without mentioning the whips, could we? That's great. So, well, I hope after the elections in 2021, you'll have plenty of time, not just to think, but also to broadcast as well, Adam, and to keep in touch with all of us. It's been a fascinating evening. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope everybody else has. And as Adam rightly says, because of the technology, you can pick it up again on the website and disseminate it that way. So that's one of the great advantages. Can I just say thanks to Ed for doing the technical side. Thanks to our Administrative Secretary, Cherry Clark, for doing all the organisation. Guy Sandhurst, who asked one of the questions, our Chair of Research, and some ideas perhaps for research further to be done that's come out of tonight as well. So many thanks, and of course, thanks to David Hunt, the Chairman of the Society. I think David's end is still working tonight, but my end is finished for now. But Adam, thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you in person, all of us, when you're able to come down again to London soon. If any of you aren't members, and that's what whetted your appetite, the subscription is a very reasonable one. So I hope you'll all sign up. So can I say thanks to everybody, a special thanks for us, Adam Tomkins, to you. It's been an absolutely great evening. Really grateful to you for delivering this, what's around one of our important events in the calendar with the Pamela Thomas Memorial Lecture. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Robin. Thank you very much for having me with you this evening. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for chairing it so brilliantly and smoothly. Enjoy the rest of the evening, everyone. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Enjoy. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye.